各位觀眾大家好，歡迎收睇26分鐘見證實錄。隨住今年夏天，卑詩樹果合作社宣布結束運作啊，越嚟越多嘅人咧開始關心到本省嘅農業生產環境同埋糧食安全問題。咁同時啊，亦都有農民提出希望各級政府咧能夠共同努力，為農民減輕負擔。
If you drive around just my neighborhood here, you'll find hundreds of acres that aren't being farmed today. That is purely ownership.
Is to say it's a bit like having a set of fine china that you never use and that you just keep in the cabinet, but you don't use it because you're scared to use it. It's a bit like that. We have to actually use the land reserve for what it was intended to do, which is farm.
When you think about the ALR, it's a pretty scarce resource. We're not making any more land. It's the only land that has the soil and climate to grow food.
We're only talking about 5% of the land base in British Columbia. We need to protect it.
This corn here will be harvested just after Labor Day.
作為家族嘅第4代農民 ，Mike Bowles 唔單止繼承咗祖輩對土地嘅熱愛，並持續關注本地嘅農業發展。佢認為卑詩省目前嘅農業用地狀況令人擔憂。
If you drive around just my neighborhood here, you'll find hundreds of acres that aren't being farmed today. That is purely ownership. Because I remember when all of it was farmed. All the farmland in Surrey used to be farmed when I was a kid and when I was getting into vegetables. In fact, you go to the Guildford Town Centre, my grandfather used to rent the land that shopping centre sits on to grow his early potatoes. Because our land here, we can't get on early enough to grow early potatoes. So even back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we were giving up productive land for urban development. So we have to find ways to disincentivize people to own farmland and not actually farm it, and incentivize people to farm. We live in a country that does not respect the producer of food. There's too much of people thinking, well, we can just buy it elsewhere. Well, when California stops exporting, where are we going to get our food? Basic food products don't travel very far very well. Yeah, you can ship cheese around the world all day long, but lettuce, you only have a couple of days. Cauliflower, a couple of days. It's a perishable product. We need to produce as much as we can at home. So we need to find a way to disincentivize developers and speculators from buying farmland, hoping someday that they can do something else with it and get it back into production.
佢指出，土地嘅耕種本身需要花費好多嘅時間同精力。除此之外，農民仲需要應付嚟自各級政府相關部門嘅各種繁複文件，對佢哋嚟講亦係一種負擔。
One of the biggest challenges is the time it takes to go through the process. So finding a way to speed up that process. The challenges farmers face are many and varied, from increasing costs, things like the carbon tax that just add costs, and farmers aren't price takers. Government can't institute regulation and policy like the carbon tax and then expect that we can just add more to it. We take the price that's offered to us. So if another jurisdiction doesn't have that same tax, we have to take the price that they're getting. We don't. So it really limits the availability of capital for farmers to do innovation. I don't think that the ALC rules really prohibit that innovation, but getting through the process, local government, and then all the environmental rules, everything that stands in our way and adds costs and paperwork. I know farmers now that have 1 and 2 people and their only job is to sit at a desk and make sure they're in compliance with all the rules that we keep piling on. So we have to find ways to streamline the process.
而今年7月下旬，運作近90年嘅卑詩樹果合作社突然關閉，令到果農措手不及。
卑詩林木水果合作社近日突然宣布結束運作，唔再接收新嘅產品，建議果農尋找替代方案銷售產品。
而菲沙河谷大學食品與農業研究所主任 Ninon Newman 就表示，咁樣唔單止係因為氣候變化導致嘅災難。
The BC tree fruit processors co-op closed, and this is a disaster. And it is partly a disaster driven by climate change, by fluctuating crops, but also a policy failure, because 3 years ago, the BC Premier's Task Force on Food Security flagged to the government that processing regulations, specifically that 50-50 rule, needed to be amended and changed. And we actually advised that it be scrapped or heavily altered, and that the government would actually have to go out and try and recruit processors so there'd be more flexibility and more processors to choose from. So what we have happen now, the sort of one-stop shop for fruit processing has closed its doors in the middle of the season, and there just isn't other capacity to pick up. And so we have farmers with fruit and nowhere to take it, and that's a disaster. It's hard to fix. We should have fixed this 3 years ago. We need to fix it now so this doesn't keep happening.
佢認為農產品同相關嘅加工產業係上下游嘅關係，而 BC 嘅政策法規限制咗農產品加工行業嘅發展，導致咗下游產業嘅流失，直接阻礙咗上游農產品嘅出路。
When I look at the 50% rule in the Agricultural Land Commission Act regulations, I really feel that this is one of the barriers to us having a resilient and flexible processing system. The rule came in about 20 years ago. Originally, processing was a completely allowed use on the ALR. It was intended to be there from the start. Premier Dave Barrett famously said, "You can't grow strawberries unless you can make strawberry jam," and that remains true. So right now, processing is an allowed use, so it's still allowed, but because you have this rule where you have to use 50% of what's produced on site, it's really hard for a processor to build a modern, flexible facility and actually make money. So they haven't been. So for the last 20 years, we've seen processors leaving.
佢強調保護不可再生嘅稀有農地資源固然重要，但係任由土地荒廢冇人耕種就違背咗初衷，亦都不利於保障卑斯嘅農業生產環境同埋糧食安全。
So I take issue, and I will give one bit of credit where credit is due. The province, and particularly the ALC, have done an amazing job of preserving the land, which we needed to do. And so that is great. But one of the examples I've given is to say it's a bit like having a set of fine china that you never use and that you just keep in the cabinet, but you don't use it because you're scared to use it. It's a bit like that. We have to actually use the land reserve for what it was intended to do, which is farm. And what we've really seen out of the ALC is this focus on preserving the land in an untouched form. And to be honest, if they want a green belt or a park, they should just say so, and then the farmers can adapt. But modern farming requires structures. It requires a little bit of concrete. It requires processing so we can use the food. And we understood that in 1970. The fact that we have shifted away from that is a tragedy, and the farmers are paying the price, and they deserve better.
佢指出，要令到耕種變得有利可圖，咁樣先至能夠吸引農民回歸農地，促進卑斯農業嘅可持續發展。
Processors are critical, and I think the public doesn't see this critical piece. And you hear processing, it can almost sound like a bad word sometimes, but we're talking about the whole thing. Like in the case of the apples, we're talking about washing, sorting, packaging, storing, putting it in chill so that we have apples in the winter. And so processing can mean a lot of things. It's absolutely critical. Without processors, we don't have farmers. Without farmers, we don't have food security. And we've really seen this. We have lost 1% of our food and farm businesses in this province every year for about the last 10 years, actually a little more. But if you look at the data, it comes out to about a 1% loss. A little bit of that is consolidation, i.e. farms coming together and becoming bigger, but most of it is people leaving the industry. And Anecdotally, I'm hearing that more and more. Third generation farmers saying, we're done. We're going to sell the land. We're going to move out of the industry. We can't make money anymore. And ultimately, food security rests on farmers being able to have a good livelihood in this province.
而農場主人 Mike Bose 亦都表示，近年嚟睇到身邊越嚟越多嘅農民正在離開呢一片佢哋世代耕種嘅土地。
It's very hard to do business in this province. Food processing is different, and it needs to be treated different. I grew for Nally's potato chips. We actually started washing and sizing our potatoes so we shipped a clean product to them. Their number one concern was the dirt that would fall out of the truck when we delivered. That was their biggest concern. You know, we'd be unloading our truck of potatoes and there'd be a lump of dirt and we'd throw the lump of dirt out. That was a problem for them. So, and it didn't make any sense to us. But those are the type of things. When we make things too difficult, people go where it's easier. They liked producing here because it was close to their market. We produced a superior product, and we do produce superior agricultural products in BC, which Fraservale stayed here for many, many years until they just couldn't weather the storm anymore. It was just too expensive. They could go to Washington State, they could go to Quebec, where they had lime programs that would increase their yield and give them a better product. We couldn't do that here. We had no program that helped us improve our soil to produce a better pea. So they eventually left. If you make the economics too difficult, people will go where it's easier. And yes, and that would be the argument for relaxing that 50-50 rule. But if you relax that 50-50 rule in the Fraser Valley, you will see farmland disappear.
咁過度寬鬆嘅土地政策係咪會導致本省嘅農業用地流失呢？面對呢啲嘅聲音，省府將會點樣回應？現時嘅農業保護區法規又係點樣被解讀嘅呢？我哋下一節翻嚟再睇。歡迎翻嚟節目時間。對於農業資源應該得到合理利用嘅呼聲不斷。但係與此同時點樣有效咁保護農業用地，並且更好咁保障本省嘅糧食安全同埋生產呢？亦都係本省正係面臨嘅重要課題。
Where we're standing right now is land that used to be a Christmas tree farm. When the Land Commission was created, this was part of the ALR. The lettuce growers wanted their own facility. They were using a facility in Richmond that was meant for root crops. It wasn't ideal for them to market their product. They built a facility here where they could package, clean, and cool and distribute the green crops, lettuce, celery, cauliflower, romaine lettuce, that kind of thing. They built a facility. So in order to build that facility, because it was ag industrial, it had to be removed from the land reserve. Fine. Is being used as an agricultural facility. Eventually, it's sold. Now it's three-story office buildings and a bunch of fast food restaurants. And this is why I can't get behind any industrialization of agriculture, because eventually the industry changes, the facility is no longer big enough.
Mike Bose 亦都提到，多年嚟佢遇到唔少投機者喺農業用地上大做文章，再藉住轉賣土地嚟到賺取利潤，而咁樣正係政府收緊土地政策嘅主要原因之一。
We don't have much control over who owns the land, and every individual has their reasons for owning land in the ALR, which isn't always farming. Sometimes it's a little bit of speculation in the hopes that maybe something else will be permitted. And as a tribunal, we react to cases that come before us. But that being said, we are concerned that it'll become more and more difficult for farmers to own land and be the ones that process if we don't have a suite of other regulatory tools and tax reforms that help incentivize for agriculture this kind of activity occurring in the ALR, which is really significant if you consider that we're a province largely dominated by mountains. And farmland is scarce, which means a reserve like the one we have is really imperative, given the immense pressure that exists out there to convert it to other uses. So, we see in the long term, like the commission's 51 years old this year, and the commission sees itself out there another 50 or 100 years trying to provide a stable and secure land base that agriculture can occur on. But in saying that, the land base itself is only one tool, and that it's really imperative that we talk about how we incentivize and encourage farming, not at the expense of others, but to the benefit of farming the primary food product. We want our farmers to be the one to grow the food that's processed, and if it isn't tied to farming, it's just an industrial use.
佢指出，目前卑詩省只有唔到5%嘅土地資源係適用於耕種。農地委員會並唔係立法部門，佢嘅主要職責係維護農業土地委員會法同相關嘅法規。
The Agricultural Land Commission, was created to protect and encourage farming, as that's described in our legislation, but we have no role or say in who can own agricultural land and in owning it, whether or not they farm it. And the commission is concerned that, land is an asset, it's attractive to investment, and that oftentimes that interest in investment can drive up the cost of land. And if held as an investment, that land is often left idle and can be very difficult for those that want to farm to access, because farmers don't always have the deepest pockets and are left to compete in a marketplace that's very open. And there's a bit of a belief that if you don't actively use your land, maybe your case to suggest it should be removed from the ALR is stronger, even though there's biophysical characteristics the commission must consider, not just whether or not it's being farmed at the moment or has been farmed. The question is it capable of farming, and is it appropriately designated in the reserve?
佢強調，土地係農業發展嘅根本，而農業保留地就係為咗保障農民嘅基本利益。
We also think that more programs, grants, skills and initiatives like the Ministry of Agriculture, small ministry in government, and that's the ministry that delivers those kinds of services, and they're critical too. They're the ones that are delivering some of the programs that helps translate into the actual activity of farming on the land, whereas we're the agency making sure that land is there and that when conversations happen about what else. And we also hope we're part of the conversation about what the future of agriculture might look like. Agriculture and farmers are innovative. They react to climate and weather, and they invent things to make farming more effective and more efficient. So, they're the backbone of BC for sure. And as an agency, we just want to be included in the conversations about what that very, very small and scarce land base could help deliver for the benefit of BC that's produced in BC. We don't want to lose out, and we don't want to become importers.
但係菲沙河谷大學食品與農業研究所主任 Nina Newman 對此就提出咗異議。佢認為隨住新移民嘅湧入，本地人口急劇增長，所有嘅土地資源變得緊張，而農業用地如果唔物盡其用，就可能面臨失守。
The lower the percentage of the ALR that's being utilized for farming gets, the more pressure there is to turn it into other things, such as housing. And right now in the Lower Mainland, about half the land in the Lower Mainland that's buildable is in the ALR. So it's a major impact. And the ALC will often minimize this. They'll say it's this tiny percentage of the province. But the problem is it's half of the Lower Mainland. And it's actually 1/3 of the private land in the entire province that's in the ALC control. So if we look at that half of that land that we desperately need for food, but for other things too, we look at that land, only half of it is being farmed. And people notice that. They notice the plummeting rate of farm utilization in the Lower Mainland. And some of that land has never been farmed, and that's because it was included for what we call continuity. So there's bits of land in the ALR that you can never farm, but they've been included, so it isn't a Swiss cheese, if you were. And the original intent was, well, we can use those for things like storage, things like processing.
對此，卑斯農業及食物廳長 Pam Alexis 彭麗斯就表示，當局必須保證農業土地嘅資源係合理開發。
There's shortages of industrial land, there's shortages of residential land, in particular in the Lower Mainland. And we have to remain vigilant in ensuring that this land is protected, because food security is just as important as the other uses, for example, housing. And we have to do things differently. We cannot take land out of the agricultural land reserve in order to do something that's not agricultural focused. Because again, we're only talking about 5% of the land base in British Columbia. We need to protect it.
而 Newman 教授就指出，如果農民嘅利益唔得到切實嘅保障，咁樣本省嘅農業陣地就會失守。
Number one, processing is an allowed use on the ALR. We're not changing anything fundamental. We're not even changing the legislation. We're just clearing red tape to make it easier to put processing on the ALR the way it was intended to be used. And we're talking about just food processing. So everything else would remain off limits. You can't build a car factory on the ALR. You can't build a tire factory. I don't know why I thought of two car things. I don't know where that came from, but it's only about food and food processing. So we're not talking about a lot of land. And I guarantee we will lose the ALR if we don't make this change, because more and more farmers will leave the industry, and eventually we'll have a government come in and say, wow, the ALR is empty. There are no farmers. Why are we holding it? Let's open it up for housing. That's my nightmare. That's what I wake up at night and think that would be like terrible. That would be a forever loss we couldn't come back from. To be honest, if we lose, a couple hundred acres of land that isn't really very good for farming here and there to support hundreds of farmers, that's a win. And we need to start thinking big picture and get out of this simplistic thinking that you just have to put the whole thing under a glass bubble, because that's how you lose it. I actually study land reserves all over the globe. The ones that last are flexible, work with industry. The ones that have failed went down that road, because at the end of the day, if you don't have farmers on that land and producers to take that food and produce it on that land, there's no one to stand up and protect it.
對此，卑斯農業及食品廳長 Pam Alexis 彭麗斯就表示，省府對於農地嘅相關政策始終係持開放嘅態度。
We're always interested because we recognize that it's a challenge to find processing land. Absolutely, especially in the Lower Mainland. And we have agricultural land that people think, okay, we've got agricultural land, let's use this. We're always looking to increase productivity, absolutely, and encourage people to produce more food, because food security is so important for British Columbians. If we do make any changes of any kind, we need to absolutely work with the sector, the producers, the farmers, those that want to operate these facilities, and look at how we can improve the process for people. We already work very closely with BC Food and Beverage. That's a large association, and we have invested in producers, both small and medium size, to encourage that food productivity. Just how important it is to work together to find solution. I would say that is the message that we would like to get out there.
好啦，今集嘅節目時間差唔多啦。咁如果觀眾對我哋嘅節目有啲乜嘢意見嘅話，係好歡迎大家以電郵嘅方式同我哋聯絡㗎。我哋嘅電郵地址係mag26@fairchildtv.com。 如果觀眾咧想上網重溫今集嘅節目，亦都可以上到去我哋嘅網站3w.fairchildtv.com， 點擊節目重溫一欄就可以睇得翻㗎啦。下星期同樣時間再同大家見面，晚安。